there are really two big studies of millionaires that have been done in the relatively recent years. A couple of national studies really asking millionaires about, again, about their behavior, about how they became millionaires and all what they do with their money, and all of those sorts of things. So when you think about millionaires, what we do know is that the number of millionaires in America is growing each and every year. And what I think when the common perception of millionaires is that they would, or at least our stereotype would be that they drive fancy cars, they maybe have expensive watches or other jewelry that would be expensive. They wear high-end clothing brands, and all kinds of, they send their kids to private school, and they're very visible indicators of their wealth. Okay. In fact, the studies of millionaires have found that these stereotypes of millionaires are, at least in general, not true. For example, one of the surveys found that the majority of millionaires never even spend even a tenth of $5,000 for a watch. So still an expensive watch, but not a $5,000 watch. Most millionaires are not driving brand new cars. And even then, most drive American-made cars, not foreign cars. And even then, an even smaller minority drive foreign luxury cars, okay? So if you really look at millionaires, they are generally not what we would stereotype them as, right? So, many millionaires in America don't become millionaires until they're in their 50s or 60s. Many are self-employed, so that is one common denominator, that they have pursued a somewhat riskier career path than others. Of those who are not self-employed, many others are in companies that had a strong 401k plan, right? In one of the studies, 80% of the millionaires that they talked to invested in their company's 401k plan. The careers include entrepreneur, engineer, accountant, teacher, management, and attorney. Right? In both of the surveys that I've looked at, about 80% of millionaires did not receive any inheritance at all from their parents or other family members. So they are what we would think of as sort of new money or new millionaires, which is really, very interesting. And that's actually kind of a historic thing as well. There's a study or some sort of study done, I believe in the 1800s, and they found this to be relatively similar as well. In 1892, they looked at 4,000 millionaires in America and reported that 84% had reached millionaire status without the benefit of inherited wealth. So that's pretty interesting. So generally speaking, again, education seems to be a common denominator among millionaires. Home ownership is a common denominator among millionaires, but most live below their means. They wear relatively inexpensive clothing. They drive American-made cars. They don't drive new cars. Okay. Most of them did not attend private school themselves. About 17% attended private school themselves, but about half of them send their children, or about half of the children of millionaires do attend some kind of private school, or who did attend a private school. Right? They believe education is important. They see that as one of the reasons for their own success. They're hard workers. They work more than 40 hours a week on average. And they have a lot of investments. That's another kind of common denominator. So they invest a good chunk of their income every year in investments. So if we look at these households, right, we are looking at households who are not out there over, spending on a lot of luxury items. Most of them are actually relatively frugal, at least in, maybe not frugal in terms of that it would be the same as a middle class person, but still frugal for what they could afford, right? Another interesting thing that they found was that 94% of, in one of the studies, 94% of the millionaires, so they live on less than they make, and about 75% have never carried a credit card balance in their lives. They said they spend $200 or less a month on restaurants, which is probably less than the average American spends, at least average American family spends on restaurants. And 93% of millionaires in this study use coupons all or some of the time when shopping. Okay, so that's a really interesting piece of consumer behavior in terms of looking at millionaires. So I just think it's a really fascinating, look into what is a millionaire, and what do millionaires actually spend their money on, what types of consumer behaviors, activities do they engage in, and so I think it's a really good indicator that looking just at someone's wealth is not always a good indicator of what we think their consumer behavior might be. Right? It's important to get the data on these things and not just look at a stereotype that we assume that millionaires would say drive luxury cars, for example. So if we look at social standing or social class, income is one of the biggest factors, but this also includes things like education, home ownership, occupation, and background to some extent, right? And then all of that really leads to what we call social standing or social class. And then, of course, we do see that on average, upper class, middle class, working class, and lower class individuals do have some generalizable preferences or purchasing habits. In your textbook, it talks about this Coleman-Rainwater social class hierarchy. Okay, so we have the upper class, which includes 3 subgroups. Right, the top 0.3, less than 1%, is that idea of inherited wealth. Okay, old money, inherited wealth. Then we have the lower upper class, which again is a very small percentage. This is a newer class of social elite, generally current professionals, C-class corporate leadership in America, right? And then we have the upper middle class, which is about 12.5%, so much larger portion compared to the other two. So we're looking at generally college graduates and with careers in fields where they would require a college degree. Some of these, their lifestyle centers on their careers. These would be the type of individuals that would be members of private clubs. They do tend to spend a lot in terms of causes and charity and donations to things like causes, the arts and things like that. Then we have the middle class or middle Americans, which is composed of the middle class and working class. Big difference here is that on average, the middle class would be more white collar jobs and some blue collar jobs. And then the working class would be more blue collar workers and lead this sort of working class lifestyle. Then lower Americans are again, a smaller portion of the country at 9% and 7% respectively. So generally speaking, upper lower would be individuals who are working but are not on any kind of welfare benefits, and their living standard is not poverty, but it is just above poverty. Okay. And then lower, which is about 7% of the population. Here we have individuals that are typically on welfare assistance, may or may not have work. If they do, oftentimes it's inconsistent work, and definitely are below the poverty line. So if we look at these and really cross-section that with income, education, and occupation, 3 different other demographic variables that we've looked at in this chapter. Okay, we can really compare and contrast here where we have, the upper making $1 million a year, which again is a very, very small percentage. And then you have middle Americans who are making between $30,000 and $60,000 a year. Interestingly, I think it was about a third of millionaires never made a 6-figure salary in their entire lives, and they still became millionaires. Okay, and then we have lower Americans that generally make around $20,000 or less. Okay, and you can see here that the education kind of follows that, where we work ourselves up from not graduating high school to high school and college graduates, and then generally to some sort of additional education for those upper Americans. And then again, you can see that the occupations then follow those different degrees. So there's this idea of this aspirational groups that we talk about. We will talk about in addition in another chapter, of where we look out into society and we see different groups that we would like to be a part of, but that we're not a part of yet, or maybe we'll never be a part of. So oftentimes, we could look at any of the classes, especially middle class and lower class, and see that generally our aspiration would be to belong to whatever that next level up is. And so sometimes we'll actually see that people will then consume or purchase the products that they perceive to be those used by that upper class, that class that they are aspiring to. Okay, so as a marketer, we may actually position our products and advertise our products as whatever that sort of upper level is. Okay. So even though it's a middle class, maybe we even have priced it at a middle class range, but then we're going to advertise it as slightly above that in order to use this upward pull strategy with consumers. So an example that's in your book that I think is a really good one looks at these different these jeans by Levi's. And so what we find with Levi's is that they're one of those companies that has a product for kind of every consumer. Okay, we have $20 Levi's jeans that you can buy at like Walmart or Target, which is really that working class lifestyle and individuals who are just contented at that lifestyle. Okay, then we have this sort of middle class product positioning, where we have that the price goes up a little bit. You'd have to go to a department store like Macy's to get it. Okay, so you see that all of the 4 Ps really fit with this middle class positioning. Okay, they're targeting middle class consumers and working class consumers who are aspiring to be middle class. Okay, then we move up to the next level, and again, we're going to see that all of our 4 Ps are focused on consumers who are either in the upper middle class already and they're contented to be there, or middle class individuals who are aspiring to be in that upper middle class lifestyle. And so they want to portray that image that even though I may not really be in that category, I'm going to portray the image that I am. Okay, and so you see the price goes up. Okay, the imaging is a little bit different in terms of the advertising. And again, and even the place is a little bit different in terms of distribution. You have to go to more boutiques to get this Levi's particular product. So I would challenge you. This is not for it's not an assignment. This is just sort of a challenge for me, is to think about social classes and this idea of aspiring and contented individuals, and so to create a demographic profile for what you think the ideal target market is for these self-lacing sneakers that Nike came out with to mimic those that were actually found in Back to the Future. Okay. They actually exist now, and so I would encourage you to look those up and kind of think about, what do you think would be the appropriate target market for these particular sneakers based on the demographics found that we talked about in this chapter: age, occupation, education, social class, etc. So that's my challenge to you, and that wraps up chapter 4.